Welcome back for another deep dive into today's top stories. It's February 19, 2025, and climate change is taking center stage again.
Yeah, seems like it's always making headlines these days. It's really woven into so many global
It
issues.
really is, from politics to economics, even human rights.
Definitely, we'll be looking at all those angles today.
So let's jump right in and start with some international news. The UN Climate Weeks are back on the agenda.
They are after being canceled last year because of funding issues for the UNFCCC.
Yeah, that was a bit of a setback, but they're back now with a renewed focus on speeding up climate negotiations and a special emphasis on the Global South.
Holding these events in the Global South is a pretty significant move, I think. It acknowledges that developing nations are hit hardest by climate change, even though they've contributed the least to causing it.
Right, it's about putting the spotlight where it's needed most. But speaking of commitments, there's some troubling news coming out of the climate finance world. The world's biggest climate finance coalition is in a bit of a crisis.
It is. Several North American banks have pulled out of a net zero alliance, and now the remaining members are trying to figure out what to do.
It does make you wonder about the future of these kinds of coalitions and whether they can really make a difference.
Yeah, is this a sign of waning commitment from financial institutions, or is it a much-needed wake-up call, a sign that they need to rethink their strategies and focus on real-world impact?
I guess time will tell. But while we're talking about global issues, there's a recent study that's really unsettling. It reveals a strong link between climate migration and modern slavery. Apparently, over 90% of Bangladeshi migrants who left climate-affected areas for work ended up in forced labor.
That's a really disturbing statistic. It highlights how climate change not only displaces people, but also makes them incredibly vulnerable to exploitation.
Absolutely. And it raises a lot of ethical questions about labor practices and responsibility.
Definitely, we need stronger legal frameworks to protect climate migrants and ensure ethical labor practices worldwide.
Now let's turn our attention to Zambia. They're attracting a lot of international investors interested in developing their copper resources, which are essential for EV batteries.
It's a huge opportunity for Zambia to become a key player in the global EV market.
But it also comes with challenges, right?
Of course, there are communities who depend on informal and often dangerous mining practices. They need to be included and benefit from this development too.
It's a balancing act, for sure. Meanwhile, Brazil is pushing back against a proposed UN carbon levy on international shipping. They argue it's unfair to developing nations and could worsen economic inequality.
It's a tricky situation. It highlights the challenges of reconciling climate action with economic concerns, especially for countries that rely heavily on exports.
Now let's shift gears and look at some U.S. news. The Trump administration is making some bold moves on the energy front. They're fast-tracking approvals for hundreds of fossil fuel projects, citing a national energy emergency.
At the same time, they've frozen funding for clean energy initiatives like the Solar for All program, and FEMA has stopped enforcing a rule requiring flood protection for public buildings in flood zones.
These actions seem to signal a pretty significant shift in priorities.
They do, and it's sparked a lot of debate about the long-term consequences for both the environment and the economy.
It's certainly raising questions about the administration's commitment to climate change mitigation and disaster preparedness.
And adding to the complexity are some interesting developments in U.S. nuclear policy. The administration has reinstated staff at the National Nuclear Security Administration after a wave of dismissals, but at the same time, they've blocked billions in environmental justice funds.
It's a bit of a head-scratcher, isn't it?
It is. On the one hand, they're emphasizing national security and nuclear capabilities, but on the other hand, they're undermining efforts to address the disproportionate environmental burdens faced by marginalized communities, often the ones living near nuclear sites.
It seems like there are a lot of competing priorities at play here.
Definitely. And it will be interesting to see how these policies unfold in the coming months.
Now let's talk about the political landscape surrounding climate action. It seems like there's a growing disconnect between political rhetoric and the realities on the ground.
Yeah, we're seeing Republican lawmakers who previously opposed climate funding now requesting those same funds for their own states and districts.
It's almost as if the impacts of climate change are hitting closer to home and forcing a change in perspective.
Perhaps. And speaking of political shakeups, the top prosecutor in D.C. has resigned amidst an investigation into Biden's climate funding.
That definitely raises questions about transparency and accountability.
It does. The investigation will likely focus on whether those funds were allocated ethically and transparently, or whether political considerations played a role.
It's a reminder that even with something as crucial as climate funding, politics can get in the way.
It's a complex issue. And then there's California, which is taking a different approach to promoting electric trucks. They've decided to back off their electric truck mandate and instead focus on offering incentives.
It seems like a more strategic approach, recognizing that mandates can often face resistance and legal challenges.
It could be. They're hoping to encourage the adoption of electric trucks without getting bogged down in political battles.
So a bit of a carrot instead of a stick approach?
Exactly.
Well, that's a lot to digest already, but we've got plenty more to cover. Stay tuned for part 2 of our deep dive, where we'll delve deeper into these stories and more.
Wow, it really is amazing how these stories all connect back to climate change. It's everywhere you look.
It is, and it's not just a future problem. It's happening now.
Exactly. We were just talking about those UN climate weeks and their focus on accelerating negotiations. And then you see these extreme weather events like that heat wave in Rio and the wildfires in the Northeast.
Speaking of those wildfires, they're a perfect example of what scientists are calling hydroclimate whiplash.
Right. You hear that term more and more these days. Basically, it refers to those increasingly extreme swings between drought and heavy rainfall that we're seeing.
And it's all driven by climate change.
Yeah, climate change is making those swings more frequent and more intense, which makes it incredibly hard for communities to prepare and adapt.
It's like the climate is on a roller coaster ride.
That's a good way to put it. And speaking of roller coasters, let's go back to that climate finance coalition that's in crisis.
Those North American banks pulling out of their net zero pledges, it's not exactly a vote of confidence in the financial sector's commitment to climate action.
It does raise some serious questions about whether their involvement was ever truly genuine, or was it just a PR move?
And if they're not willing to put their money where their mouth is, how can we expect to see real change?
Exactly. That's the trillion-dollar question, literally.
Now, this study on climate migration and slavery, it's just heartbreaking to think about those Bangladeshi migrants who ended up in forced labor.
It's a horrific reality. Climate change isn't just about rising temperatures and extreme weather. It's about human suffering and exploitation.
And it highlights the urgent need for stronger protections for those who are most vulnerable.
We need to ensure that climate migrants have legal rights and access to safe and ethical working conditions.
So back to U.S. politics. The Trump administration's recent moves on the energy front, they're getting a lot of attention.
Yeah, they are fast-tracking fossil fuel projects while freezing clean energy funding. It's a pretty clear signal of their priorities.
And halting those flood protection regulations, it seems like a risky move.
It is, especially with the increasing frequency and intensity of extreme weather events. It's almost like they're ignoring the science.
And those shifts in nuclear policy, they're pretty puzzling too. Restating staff at the National Nuclear Security Administration while blocking environmental justice funds.
It's hard to reconcile those two actions. On the one hand, they're emphasizing nuclear security and capabilities, but on the other hand, they're neglecting the needs of communities that are most affected by nuclear activities.
It just seems like there's a lack of consistency.
And it raises concerns about whether they're truly committed to addressing environmental justice issues.
Now let's talk about those Republican lawmakers who are suddenly requesting climate funding after opposing it for so long.
It's interesting, isn't it? It seems like the political calculus is changing as climate change impacts become more visible and widespread. It's getting harder to ignore.
Even if you don't believe in the science, you can't ignore the floods and the wildfires and the heat waves.
Right. It's hitting people's wallets and their livelihoods, and that's when politicians start to pay attention.
Now those Los Angeles wildfires, they're a stark reminder of the devastating cost of climate change.
It's not just the immediate damage, it's the long-term impacts on the environment and the economy.
Soil erosion, water contamination, air pollution, it all adds up.
And the economic costs are staggering. Businesses lost homes, destroyed health problems. It's a ripple effect that can last for years.
And it's all made worse by climate change.
Absolutely. Climate change is intensifying these natural disasters, making them more frequent and more severe.
We saw it with those record-breaking temperatures in Rio, and we're seeing it with those volatile weather patterns in the Northeast.
It's a global problem that demands a global solution.
We need to transition to clean energy, reduce our emissions, and adapt to the changing climate.
Now let's move on to some more positive news. Those wolf conservation efforts, they're pretty inspiring.
Tracking those wolves in California and exploring the possibility of reintroducing them to Scotland. It's fascinating to see how these projects are helping to restore ecosystems.
Wolves are a keystone species. Their presence can have a ripple effect throughout the entire ecosystem.
And in Scotland, they could actually help mitigate climate change.
That's the idea. They could help regenerate native woodland, which would act as a carbon sink, absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere.
It's a great example of how nature-based solutions can be part of the climate solution.
And speaking of solutions, NASA just released some exciting new data from the PREFIRE mission.
That data will help scientists better understand Earth's energy balance and refine climate models.
It's a valuable tool in the fight against climate change.
And there have been some other interesting studies recently. One found that even small environmental changes can drive species to extinction.
And another showed how climate change is affecting monarch butterfly migration patterns.
It's a reminder that climate change is impacting every corner of the planet, even the smallest creatures.
It's all connected.
And finally, that grilling expert who transitioned to geothermal energy, it's a great example of how individuals can adapt and contribute to a more sustainable future.
It shows that there are opportunities in the clean energy sector and that people are willing to make a change.
It's a story of hope amidst all the challenges. That top D.C. prosecutor's resignation, it's definitely raising eyebrows, especially with the investigation into Biden's climate funding.
Yeah, it does make you wonder if there was any political pressure or influence involved.
Hopefully the investigation will shed some light on that, and those Republican lawmakers who were so against climate funding before.
Now they're requesting those same funds for their own states and districts. It's quite a turnaround.
It seems like the impacts of climate change are becoming harder and harder to ignore, even for those who tried to downplay it before.
Exactly. When those floods and wildfires start hitting close to home, it changes your perspective.
Speaking of changing perspectives, California's decision to back off their electric truck mandate, it seems like a more strategic approach.
It does. Instead of forcing the issue, they're trying to incentivize the adoption of electric trucks.
It might be a more effective way to get buy-in from the industry.
It could be. Mandates can be very polarizing and lead to legal battles.
This way they might be able to achieve their goals faster and with less resistance.
It's certainly an interesting approach to watch.
Now, those wildfires in Los Angeles, they were just devastating. And the reports about the long-term damage are pretty sobering.
It's not just the immediate impact, it's the erosion, the water contamination, the air pollution. It all adds up.
And the economic costs can be staggering, too.
Businesses and homes destroyed. People forced to relocate. The ripple effects can last for years.
It's a reminder that we can't just react to these disasters. We need to be proactive and address the root causes.
Like climate change.
Exactly. We need to reduce emissions, invest in renewable energy, and make our communities more resilient.
Those record-breaking temperatures in Rio, the wildfires in the Northeast, it's all connected.
It's a global crisis that requires a global response.
And speaking of global responses, those wolf conservation projects, they're a sign that there's still hope.
Tracking the wolves in California and potentially reintroducing them to Scotland, it's amazing how these efforts can help restore entire ecosystems.
Wolves play such a crucial role in maintaining balance. They can have a positive impact on everything from plant life to other animal populations.
And in Scotland, they could even help fight climate change by promoting forest growth.
That's the idea. It's a fascinating example of how nature can be a powerful ally in addressing climate change.
Now, NASA's release of data from the PREFIRE mission, that's another positive development.
That data will be invaluable for scientists studying Earth's energy balance and refining climate models.
And it's a reminder that science and technology can play a crucial role in tackling climate change.
Absolutely. And those recent studies on species extinction and monarch butterfly migration, they highlight the interconnectedness of it all.
Climate change is impacting every aspect of our planet, even the smallest creatures.
It's a web of life, and we're all part of it.
And finally, that drilling expert who transitioned to geothermal energy. It's a story that gives me hope.
Me too. It shows that people are willing to adapt and that there are opportunities in the green economy.
It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in building a more sustainable future.
And that even small changes can make a difference.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive for today. We've covered a lot of ground, from global politics to environmental disasters to glimmers of hope.
It's clear that climate change is the defining challenge of our time. It's impacting every aspect of our lives.
But as we've seen today, there are people and organizations working tirelessly to find solutions.
There's still time to act, but we need to do it now.
So to our listeners, we encourage you to stay informed, stay engaged, and keep pushing for change.
Together, we can create a better future.
This is The Deep Dive signing off.